The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury. Prologue. It was a warm afternoon in early September when I first met the Illustrated Man. Walking along an asphalt road, I was on the final leg of a 2 weeks walking tour of Wisconsin. Late in the afternoon, I stopped, ate some pork, beans, and a donut, and was pretending to stretch out and read when the Illustrated Man walked over the hill and stood for a moment against the sky. I didn't know he was illustrated then. I only knew that he was tall, once well-muscled, but now, for some reason, going to fat. I recalled that his arms were long and his hands thick, but that his face was like a child's set upon a massive body. He seemed to only sense my presence, for he didn't look directly at me when he spoke his first words.
"Do you know where I can find a job?"
"Afraid not," I said.
"I haven't had a job that's lasted in 40 years, he said.
Though it was a hot, late afternoon, he wore his wool shirt buttoned tight about to his neck. His sleeves were rolled and buttoned down over his thick wrists. Perspiration was streaming from his face, yet he made no move to open his shirt.
"Well," he said at last, "this is as good a place as any to spend the night. Do you mind company?"
"I have some extra food you'd be welcome to," I said.
He sat down, heavily grunting. "You'll be sorry you asked me to stay," he said. "Everyone always is. That's why I'm walking. Here it is, early September, cream of the Labor Day carnival season. I should be making money hand over fist at any small town sideshow celebration, but here I am with no prospects."
He took off an immense shoe and peered at it closely.
"I usually keep a job about 10 days. Then something happens and they fire me. By now, every carnival in America won't touch me with a 10-foot pole."
"What seems to be the trouble?" I asked. For answer, he unbuttoned his tight collar slowly. With eyes shut, he put a slow hand to the task of unbuttoning his shirt all the way down. He slipped his fingers in to feel his chest.
"Funny," he said, eyes still shut. "You can't feel them, but they're there. I always hope that someday I'll look down and they'll be gone. I walk in the sun for hours on the hottest days, baking, and hope that my sweat'll wash 'em off. The sun'll cook 'em off. But at sundown, they're still there."
He turned his head slightly towards me and exposed his chest.
"Are they still there now?"
After a long while, I exhaled. "Yeah, they're still there." The illustrations.
"Another reason I keep my collar buttoned up," he said, "is the children. They'll follow me along country roads. Everyone wants to see the pictures, and yet nobody wants to see them."
He took his shirt off and wadded it in his hands. He was covered with illustrations, from the blue tattooed ring about his neck to his belt line.
"It keeps right on going," he said, guessing my thought. "All of me is illustrated. Look."
He opened his hand. Among his palm was a rose freshly cut with drops of crystal water among the soft pink petals. I put my hand out to touch it, but it was only an illustration. As for the rest of him, I cannot say how I sat and stared, for he was a riot of rockets and fountains and people, in such intricate detail and color that you could hear the voices murmuring, small and muted, from the crowds that inhabited his body. When his flesh twitched, the tiny mouths flickered, the tiny green and gold eyes winked, the tiny pink hands gestured. There were yellow meadows and blue rivers and mountains and stars and suns and planets spread in a Milky Way across his chest. The people themselves were in 20 or more odd groups among his arms, shoulders, back, sides, wrists, as well as the flat on his stomach. You found them in forests of hair, lurking among a constellation of freckles, or peering from armpit caverns, diamond eyes all aglitter. Each seemed intent upon its own activity. Each was a separate gallery portrait. "Why, they're beautiful," I said. How can I explain about his illustrations? If El Greco had painted miniatures in his home, no bigger than your hand, infinitely detailed with all its sulfurous color, elongation, and anatomy, perhaps he might have used this man's body for his art. The colors burned in 3 dimensions. They were windows looking in upon fiery reality. Here, gathered on one wall, were all the finest scenes in the universe. The man was a walking treasure gallery. This wasn't the work of a cheap carnival tattoo man with 3 colors and whiskey on his breath. This was the accomplishment of a living genius, vibrant, clear, and beautiful.
"Oh, yes," said the illustrated man. "I'm so proud of my illustrations that I'd like to burn them off. I've tried sandpaper, acid, a knife."
The sun was setting and the moon was already up in the east.
"For you see," said the illustrated man, "these illustrations predict the future."
I said nothing.
"It's all right in the sunlight. I could keep a carnival day job, but at night, the pictures move. The pictures change."
I must have smiled. "How long have you been illustrated?"
"In 1900, when I was 20 years old, and working a carnival, I broke my leg. It laid me up. I had to do something to keep my hand in, so I decided to get tattooed."
"But who tattooed you? What happened to the artist?"
"She went back to the future," he said. "I mean it. She was an old woman with a little house in the middle of Wisconsin here somewhere, not far from this place. A little old witch who looked 1,000 years old one moment and 20 years old the next. But she said she could travel in time." I laughed. Now I know better.
"How did you happen to meet her?" He told me he had seen her painted sign by the road. Skin illustration. Illustration instead of tattoo. Artistic. So he had sat all night while her magic needles stung him wasp stings and delicate bee stings, and by morning, he looked like a man who had fallen into a 20-color print press and been squeezed out, all bright and picturesque.
"I've hunted every summer for 50 years, he said, putting his hand out in the air. "When I find that witch, I'm gonna kill her."
The sun was gone. Now the first stars were shining, and the moon had brightened the fields of grass and wheat. Still, the illustrated man's pictures glowed like charcoals in the half-light, like scattered rubies and emeralds, with Rouault colors and Picasso colors and long, pressed-out El Greco bodies.
"So people fire me when my pictures move. They don't like when violent things happen in my illustrations. Each illustration is a little story. If you watch them, in a few minutes they'll tell you a tale. In 3 hours of looking, you could see 18 or 20 stories acted right out on my body. You could hear voices and think thoughts. It's all here just waiting for you to look. But most of all, there's a special spot on my body." He bared his back. "See, there's no special design on my right shoulder blade, just a jumble."
"Yeah?"
"When I've been around a person long enough, that spot clouds over and fills in. If I'm with a woman, her picture comes there on my back in an hour and shows her whole life. How she'll live, how she'll die, and what she'll look like when she's 60. And if it's a man, an hour later,
His picture's here on my back. It shows him falling off a cliff or dying under a train, so I'm fired again. All the time he had been talking, his hands had wandered over the illustrations, as if to adjust their frames, to brush away dust, the motions of a connoisseur, an art patron. Now he lay back, long and full in the moonlight. It was a warm night. There was no breeze, and the air was stifling. We both had our shirts off. And you never found the old woman?
Never.
And you think she came from the future?
How else could she know these stories she painted on me?
He shut his eyes tiredly. His voice grew fainter. Sometimes at night I can feel them. The pictures like ants crawling on my skin. And then I know they're doing what they have to do. I never look at them anymore. I just try to rest. I don't sleep much. Don't you look at them either, I warn you. Turn the other way when you sleep. I lay back a few feet from him. He didn't seem violent, and the pictures were beautiful. Otherwise, I might have been tempted to get out and get away from such babbling, but the illustrations... I let my eyes fill up on them. Any person would go a little mad with such things upon his body. The night was serene. I could hear the illustrated man's breathing in the moonlight. Crickets were stirring gently in distant ravines. I lay with my body sideways so I could watch the illustrations. Perhaps half an hour had passed. Whether the illustrated man slept, I could not tell, but suddenly I heard him whisper,
"They're moving, aren't they?"
I waited a minute. "Yeah," I said. The pictures were moving, each in its turn, each for a brief minute or two, there in the moonlight with the tiny twinkling thoughts and the distant sea voices. It seemed each little drama was enacted. Whether it took an hour or 3 hours for the dramas to finish, it would be hard to say. I only know that I lay fascinated and did not move while the stars wheeled in the sky. 18 illustrations, 18 tales. I counted them one by one. Primarily, my eyes focused upon a scene, a large house with 2 people in it. I saw a flight of vultures on a blazing flesh sky. I saw yellow lions. I heard voices. The first illustration quivered and came to life.
Epilogue. It was almost midnight. The moon was high in the sky now. The illustrated man lay motionless. I had seen what there was to see. The stories were told. They were over and done. There remained only that empty space upon the illustrated man's back, that area of jumbled colors and shapes. Now, as I watched, the vague patch began to assemble itself, in slow dissolvings from one shape to another and still another. And at last, a face formed itself there, a face that gazed out at me from the colored flesh, a face with a familiar nose and mouth, familiar eyes. It was very hazy. I saw only enough of the illustration to make me leap up. I stood there in the moonlight, afraid that the wind or the stars might move and wake the monstrous gallery at my feet. But he slept on, quietly. The picture on his back showed the illustrated man himself, with his fingers about my neck, choking me to death. I didn't wait for it to become clear and sharp and a definite picture. I ran down the road in the moonlight. I didn't look back. A small town lay ahead, dark and asleep. I knew that long before morning I would reach the town.